Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about the book of Esther. The story begins, let me back up a bit. Remember how the Jews, specifically after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, had been taken into captivity, what we call the Babylonian captivity. But then Babylon itself, after that, did not last all that long as a empire. Instead, you have a people group. Actually, there's the Medes to the northeast of Babylon, and to their direct east, the Persians. And a king arose. Was he from the Medes or was he from the Persians? And the answer is yes. He was actually both. The story goes that his father was a Persian, his mother was a Mede. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he's going to bring forth what we call the Persian Empire. And he doesn't conquer Babylon. He actually just walks in and takes it without a fight. According to his records, he says, they opened the gates for me, and I'm here, and I'm not here to persecute you, but I'm here to liberate you. But we have now the advent of the Persian Empire. He's going to inherit what Babylon had, and he's going to expand it greatly. That as our story opens, we have the Persian Empire, and the story opens in a city. It's one of the cities of the Persians. It's one of their capital cities. They would have both a winter palace and a summer palace, but this is one of those. And the city is called Susa. And so that's going to be the setting for the story. It's during the time of the Persian Empire. Our cast of characters for the story, there's four main characters. We have Esther. She's also known as Hadassah, so she has both a Persian, I assume that's a Persian name, but also a Jewish name because she is Jewish, although that's going to be hidden from others for the greater part of the book. Secondly, there is Ahajuris. He's going to be the king. And I'll come back to that name in just a moment. Next, there is Mordecai. He is the cousin of Esther, but he seems like he's perhaps a little older, and he is serving as her guardian. And finally, there's the villain of the story, and his name is Haman, and he's going to be known as Haman the Agagite, and we'll see the significance of that as well. First thing I want to ask is, who is this Ahajuris? Traditionally, most scholars think that this is Xerxes, one of the Persian kings. You had started with Cyrus the Great, and he was followed by Cambyses, and then Cambyses died and didn't leave an heir. So you had Darius, who was a distant cousin of Cyrus, and then Xerxes. And of course, Xerxes, if you remember, he was the king who tried to, actually, his father had tried to do this first. His father, Darius, tried to invade Greece, Battle of Marathon, that didn't work so well. And 10 years later, Xerxes did that, and he did invade Greece, but he wasn't able, he was finally driven out, and a certain victory for the Greeks, not so much for the Persians. But it wasn't a terrible defeat for the Persians. Persian Empire is going to last for another nearly 200 years. So this Ahajuris is commonly thought to be Xerxes. The story of Esther begins in the third year of Ahajuris. So if it is Xerxes, then the beginning of the story is taking place before that whole invasion of Greece. But then, and yes, this would have been prior to Xerxes' invasion of Greece, but then Esther becomes the queen in the seventh year of Ahajuris, is Esther chapter 2, verse 16. So again, if this is Xerxes, the rest of the story takes place after that Greek invasion. And so it would span that if it is Xerxes. Now, I'm not sure that that's the case. Another possibility, some have suggested that this is the son of Xerxes, known as Artaxerxes. He comes a bit later, being his son. And Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, who writes so much about Jewish history, he endorsed this view. In fact, he doesn't say there was two views. He just says this is Artaxerxes. He might be right. He might be wrong. It's noted that this isn't really convincing, but Nehemiah, you remember, is the cupbearer of the king, and there's a lot of drinking going on in the book of Esther. In fact, almost everything is going to take place at a festival or a celebration or a party. There's also going to be 7 princes of the Medes and Persians that are going to be mentioned in Esther chapter 1 and verse 14. And it's been suggested that that might correspond to Ezra chapter 7, verse 14, where you have 7 counselors that are mentioned, counselors of the king. Is that convincing? I don't know. I'm just going to leave it as an unknown, and I'm just going to call him Ahajuris. Is that a name? Is that a title? I'm not even sure about that. I suspect it might actually be a title or perhaps a family name, but that's held by more than one person. Of course, names are like that too. Now, our story opens then. Now, it took place in the days of Ahajuris, the Ahajuris who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So this is in the Persian Empire. Notice 127 provinces. Actually, there were less satrapies. So provinces is referring to, well, we might think of counties or something like that. But still, a very wide area. It's that Ahajuris. And as the story begins in verse 3, in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet. And I said, we're going to have lots of eating. There's going to be lots of eating and drinking. And this is going to be a story that revolves around bunches and bunches of banquets. And so he gives this banquet and he shows everybody how great he is. This display that goes on for 180 days. What do you do after you've had that kind of banquet? Verse 5, when these days were completed, the king gave a banquet. He gives a banquet to celebrate the end of the banquet. And it lasts 7 days. Notice all the sevens, too. There's going to be lots of sevens in this chapter. And there's all sorts of great things that are taking place at this banquet. And meanwhile, verse 9, Queen Vashti, now he's Ahajuris, but he has a queen. Her name is Vashti. She also gave a banquet. So there's two parallel banquets. One is the men's banquet and one is the women's banquet. And verse 10, on the seventh day, notice how we had this lasting for 7 days. When the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded, and what he does, he calls for an order from these 7 eunuchs in verse 10. He invites the queen to come to from the women's banquet to the men's banquet in order to display her beauty. Now, that wasn't really proper for the top queen. It might be okay for a concubine or a serving girl or something like that. And so she says, I'm not coming. She refuses the command of the king to come, which sets forth our initial problem. And so the king has to consult the wise men. He's not sure. He's not making his own decision. And we have 7 of these wise men, 7 princes of Persia, verse 14. And they come up with a plan. Maybe you ought to step in and do something, because this could create all sorts of social upheavals of women not obeying their husbands. And so maybe you ought to sort of put her aside and get another queen. And so this is what is determined to do. So notice we go from the king of Persia celebrating to chapter 2, where the king is going to put out a beauty contest in order to get another queen. And this takes place, chapter 2 and verse 5. Now there was at the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai. So he enters the picture, and we're going to see both him. I have to mention this. Whose name was Mordecai, this is chapter 2, verse 5, a son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Now hold that note, that Mordecai, and of course this would be true of his cousin, Esther, they are both from the tribe of Benjamin. That's going to be significant, even though it's not mentioned later. You're just pack that away and file it. They are from the tribe of Benjamin. And verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, so both of these names are given. This is his uncle's daughter, which makes them cousins. And so he urges her to join the beauty contest. And so verse 9, chapter 2, verse 9, so the young lady pleased him, that is, pleases the chief of the eunuchs, who's sort of in charge of putting together the beauty contest, and he quickly provided her with with cosmetics, food, and gave her 7 choice maids, notice the 7 again, from the king's palace, and so she's taken care of. But notice verse 10, Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. So she's going to win the beauty contest, but it's not known that she's Jewish. Her family background, she's just a subject of the Persian Empire. And so Esther is going to be elevated, and everything is good, and she's moved into the palace, and she wins the beauty contest, and she becomes the bride of the king. This is chapter 2, verse 16, in the 7th year of his reign. And not only that, the king loves Esther, and what does he do because he loves Esther? Verse 18, the king gave a great banquet. We have another banquet, and this one is Esther's banquet, and everybody's invited, and they get to see the queen, and everything is good. But now another problem arises. This is right at the end of the chapter, verse 21. In those days, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now he's taken a position sort of as the king is his patron. The king's taking care of him. After all, he's related to the queen, and that gives him not an exalted position, but where he gets certain small benefits. And while he is there, he overhears two officials who were plotting against the king. And he happens to overhear, and he passes the word on to Queen Esther, who passes the word on to the king, and the plot is uncovered, and they're both captured. The plotters, the assassins, or would-be assassins, are captured, and they are both hanged on a gallows. The way they would do that back then, they would actually impale them. Literally, it says they were hanged on a tree. Not necessarily by the neck. It might be by some other body parts that are equally discomforting. But they're put to death, and that's written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence and filed away for future reference. Next, we come to chapter 3, and in chapter 3, we're going to see the big problem of the entire book. We've had some small problems that have been moving the story, but now chapter 3, verse 1, after these events, King Ahajuris promoted Haman. Now, Haman's going to be the villain, but notice he's called Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And again, you're supposed to hear that term Agagite, and it is supposed to be somewhat familiar. You say, well, I've never heard of an Agagite. If you go back and think of 1 Samuel chapter 15, there was an infamous Agag who had been the enemy of Israel during the time of King Saul. Remember, I said that Esther and Mordecai were from the tribe of Benjamin, but also from the family of Cush. And Cush is the same family from which Saul came. So they're actually related to King Saul. Like I said, we're going to gather that together at the end. So here is Haman, and Haman is one of the king's servants, and he begins to be elevated, and it comes about that as Haman is elevated, everybody bows down to him and everybody pays homage to him, except Mordecai. And for some reason, we're not told exactly why, Mordecai decides, I don't really care for him, and he does not bow, he does not grovel. And bowing and groveling was a way to give people honor, and this was an honor and shame culture, so it's very important to the people back then. And Mordecai is not being politically correct. And so when Haman begins to ask, who's this person who's not being politically correct with me? He's not bowing like he ought to. Oh, that's Mordecai the Jew. And it because Esther had hidden her origins, but Mordecai hasn't hidden his. And so chapter 3 and verse 4, he had told them that he was a Jew. And so Haman now comes upon a plot. And the plot isn't just going to try to get rid of Mordecai, which might be just a touch sticky, but he's going to get rid of all the Jews. And so this is escalating, and Haman approaches the king with a plan. If this indeed was Xerxes, remember Xerxes needed money to pay for his army and for his military campaigns, whether they succeeded or not. And I'm not saying that it was, but if that was the case, you need some ready cash. Here's a way you can get it, and here's the plan. There's these people that are sort of historically rebellious. That's why they're here. They were expelled from their former homeland, and if you declare them to be outlaws, then we can go get all of their possessions, and that will greatly increase your bank account, and you can benefit from this. And he sells it to the king, who really doesn't know that much about Jews, doesn't really care that much about Jews, but anything to increase his bank account. Notice the king is not necessarily the hero of the story. And so an edict then is assigned, And the way they go about this, chapter 3 and verse 7, in the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahajuris, I notice some time has passed again, Pur, now what's that word pur? Pur, that is the lot, was cast. They would cast the lots before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Uh, for some reason, he was casting lots, trying to figure out what would be the good day. Maybe this is some sort of spiritism, how people roll the dice or they look for signs in the heaven. Here they were casting lots to figure out what would be the great day to do this deed, and they came up with the 12th month, the month Adar, corresponds roughly to our February. Right at the end of the Jewish year. Remember, their year begins around March, April, so February, March would be this time of year. The casting of the pur, this is going to be the great time. And so in verse 10, the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Notice that he keeps referencing again and again how he is an Agagite, sort of reminding us. But this is taking place 12 months earlier. So 12 months from now, we're going to announce it, and the word's going to go out across the internet, but we don't have internet, so it's going to take 12 months to get the word out all across the empire that it will be open season on Jews. And the target date is coming. So the edict against the Jews has been set. Now, Mordecai is going to send word. He can't speak directly to her because she's the queen, and there's a harem, and he's not allowed to go in there. But he is allowed to send word through an intermediary, and he does so, that you need to approach the king and speak to the king. And she's a little reluctant to do this because she's not allowed to go if she has not been summoned, and she hasn't been summoned in a while because he's maybe been enjoying some of the other wives that he has. And so she's there in the palace, but she doesn't see the king on a regular basis. In fact, she nowadays sees the king on a very irregular basis, or maybe not at all. And Mordecai again sends word back. You shouldn't be quiet on this. He says in verse 14, or actually verse 13, do not imagine that you in the king's house can escape any more than all the Jews, because if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. It might be that you were put in this place for that reason. And so Esther sends word back. Like I said, this is all taking place through intermediaries. He says, okay, I want you to tell all the Jews that they fast, don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And we'll fast here in the harem, and you fast there, and then I will do what you ask. Notice that 3 days. I think that's interesting. I've got a friend that likes to say, whenever you see 3 days in the Old Testament, take a look. Maybe it's a picture of Jesus, and maybe we'll see that. But now we come to chapter 5. It came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes, and she's going to throw a banquet for the king. She actually goes into the presence of the king, and instead of saying "off with your head," he says, "Why are you here?" And he says, I'd like to invite you to a banquet. And this is chapter 5, verse 4. If it please the king, may the king, and she even invites Haman, may they come this day to the banquet. And the king says, oh, banquets, I love banquets, so certainly I'll come to the banquet. And they both come, and they eat and they drink wine at the banquet. And Meanwhile, while this is taking place, or immediately after the first banquet, Haman speaks to his wife. Her name is Zeresh. She's a minor character, so I'm not really going to get into her. But at her urging, he says, okay, the plan's coming together really well. Why don't you build a big giant gallows? It's going to be 50 cubits high. That's like 75 feet high. This is a big giant post. And remember, we say gallows and we think hanging from the neck. They think maybe hanging from other body parts, but it kills you nevertheless, either slowly or painfully, or I don't know. but he builds this instrument for the death of Mordecai. But like I said, Esther invites him to the banquet, and the king says, "Okay, you got me here, and I came to the banquet. What is it that you want?" And Esther, I mean, maybe this is part of her overall plan, or maybe she just chickens out. But she says, "I want to have you come to another banquet," and so she invites him to a second banquet, and he says, "Oh, I love banquets. I'll come." And then Haman goes out and he builds the gallows. And now we come to the pivotal point in the entire story. It's in chapter 6, and everything up to this point has been going bad. There's things, where Vashti has been put aside, and yes, Esther was elevated, but there's this plan against the Jews and a plea, and Esther didn't really want to do it, and she couldn't bring herself to bring it to say it, maybe by design, maybe by getting afraid at the end. Haman's building the gallows, and everything's been conspiring against the Jewish people, not just against Esther, not just against Mordecai, but against all the Jewish people. So it's something that affects everyone. But now in chapter 6, it just by chance, the king can't sleep. What do you do when you can't sleep? Well, sometimes you read. Now, I don't read when I can't sleep because that doesn't make me get sleepy. But when I was very young, I used to have what they called a tape recorder, like a recording device. And I had one lecture from a sweet old professor. He was a nice gentleman, loved the Lord. He was a Christian. But he could be a little bit, can I say it? He could be a little bit boring. And so I would turn on the tape, and after about 3, 4, 5 minutes, just the sound of his voice would put me to sleep. Well, in the case of the king, he couldn't sleep, and so he says, "Well, bring me a book of the records, the chronicles, just the histories, and it's not the exciting stuff, just the dull, boring." And he figures that'll put him to sleep. And they happened to bring him the story of this assassination plot. And it wasn't exciting because it never got off the ground. And all of a sudden, the king is wide awake, and he says, "By the way, that Mordecai who reported that, because it had been entered into the records, did we ever do anything nice for him?" And they look down the records. "No, nothing's here about we never repaid Mordecai." "Okay, well, call for Haman." And Haman just happens to be there in one of the outer courts, and so Haman comes and, "Oh, what do you want?" And the king says, "What should we do for somebody that we desire to honor? We want to give somebody great honor." And Haman's thinking, "Well, I can't think of anybody more deserving of honor than me, because I've been helping the king with his finances and coming up with great plans to do it with the Jews." And so Haman says, "Here's what you ought to do. Bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and the head on which his crown has been placed, and dress up this man just as if he were the king, and let him ride through the city where everybody sees him." And remember, this is an honor and shame culture, where everybody sees him and gives him great honor, and everybody just bows down. And it is said, "Here is what we do for the one whom the king desires to honor." And the king says, "That's a great idea. I want you to do that for Mordecai." And Haman hears that, "Mordecai, oh my goodness, what have I said?" And I can imagine, in fact, he goes home and he's putting ashes on his head, with not ashes, he covers his head in mourning, and he speaks to his wife about it. And she says, "What, man, you better be careful. You better take care, because the king is actually honoring Mordecai. You're going to have to go along with that." And meanwhile, while they're still talking, the king's eunuchs arrive and say, "Hey, next banquet is here. Time to come to the banquet." And so now Haman comes to the second banquet. So we had a first banquet, and at the second banquet, the king says, "Okay, we've been to 2 banquets. Was there something else that you wanted?" And Esther says, "Yes." And he doesn't invite. She does not invite him to a third banquet. And instead, she reveals the problem. She says, "There's a plot against your queen." A plot against my queen? Oh, yes, yes, there's a plot, because your queen is Jewish, and there was this whole idea to do away with the Jews. So it's a plot that was aimed at me, your queen, and because it's aimed at me, it's sort of a plot against you, O king. And the king says, "Whoa, whoa, see about that. Who?" And the king goes out to inquire. He leaves the banquet for a minute, begins asking questions. And meanwhile, Haman is there, and Haman rushes over to the queen. He says, "You have to protect me." And just then the king walks back in and sees Haman there by the queen. And you're not supposed to be by the queen if you're not the king, if you're not married to her. "What are you doing with my wife? What do you think you're doing there? That's wrong." And what shall we do with such a person that attacks the queen? And one of the servants says, "Well, there's this big gallows outside. Great! Go hang him on it." And Haman is taken out and placed on exactly the same gallows that he had planned for Mordecai. But notice the problem hasn't gone away. Haman's gone away. He's out of it. But the problem is that there's an edict that's already been passed, the 12th month, and we're getting closer to that 12th month, the longer we wait, on which all the Jews are going to be put to death. And so a plea now in chapter 8 is made to the king, and Esther goes to the king and implores him to avert the evil plans of Haman the Agagite. And notice he's still called Haman the Agagite, chapter 8, verse 3. And again in chapter 8 and verse 5, Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews that are in all the king's provinces. And the king says, "Well, there's a problem. Once I put out a decree, it's our custom. The king's word is law. And I can't just go back and say, well, never mind what the king said." That sort of undercuts the king. And so we have to have a bigger we have a problem in underscoring that. And so Mordecai, this is still in chapter 8, he says, "Well, all you need to do is give a different edict. Not you're not going to contradict the one you gave, but you're going to add to it an addendum that when it comes time to kill all the Jews, that the Jews are allowed to fight back against those who would kill them." And so you just give them the right, and that way both of these edicts stand. They are both law. The king goes along with that idea. Okay, the Jews are allowed to fight back. And what that's going to do is those who are intent on trying to do away with the Jews will themselves be put to death. And that's exactly what takes place. And the edict goes out, and the Jews hear this. And what do the Jews do? They celebrate. At the end of chapter 17, "And many among the people of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them." So not only is this a celebration, not only do they live, but this becomes actually something of an evangelistic push, where this has brought the Jewish people to the attention of all the other people in the Persian Empire. And there are those who say, "Gee, how could we become Jewish?" I mean, they're not going to change their ethnicity, but they're going to start following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And by the way, when it says in middle of verse 17, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. That word feast is the same word we've translated banquet earlier. So there's a party. And now that the Jews are saved, Mordecai is elevated to a great and high position. As a result of this elevation, in chapter 9 and verse 17, this was done on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting, of banqueting, and rejoicing. And therefore, verse 19, "Therefore the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food with one another." So he is elevated. The Jews are saved. And when we get to the end of chapter 9 and chapter 10, this becomes an ongoing celebration, which among our Jewish friends is celebrated to this day. And this celebration is known as Purim, because in chapter 9 and verse 24, for Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary for all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the lots. That's how they sort of determined, with this sort of a seance sort of thing, on which day this was going to take place. They had cast a lot. And so verse 26, therefore they called these days Purim. The im part is just plural. The lots after the name of Pur. And because of the instructions of this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them. And so the story is celebrated to this day, this time when the Jews were threatened with annihilation, but when they overcame and instead were delivered, and it was their enemies who were put to death in their place. Now, verse 24, I already mentioned this, but I want to just focus again on it. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. And I said Agag reminds us of that earlier Agag back in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now, is that the same Agag that's referenced here? I don't want to necessarily say that it is, but it's the same name. And so even if it's not the same person, it's the same name. And so one becomes a type of the other. And you go full circle for how this theme comes together, just how Israel had an enemy back in the days of King Saul in Agag. So here Israel has an enemy in the person of Haman, who is also described as an Agagite. And so the entire story is one of contrast between Haman and Mordecai, where Haman, whether he really was or not, he's called an Agagite. Is that literally the king of the Amalekites whose life is solid spirit in disobedience to the command of God? Or is it just a name that's connected and it's an echo of the same name and so carries like a symbolism? I'll take either one. And then there's Mordecai, who had been both from the tribe, but even from the family of Saul. Now, I'm not saying he was a descendant of Saul in particular, but he was a descendant of one of Saul's kin, one of Saul's brothers. And so he's connected to the family of Saul. And in the case of Haman, he'd been the enemy of the people of God. Mordecai then, both Mordecai and Esther, but Mordecai is seen here as the savior of God's people. Now, some points to ponder. I've given you the story, but we ought to note that Esther is the book of God's providence. God is behind the scenes, even though God is not specifically mentioned. The success of Haman's plot would exterminate the seed through which Messiah would come. So if Haman's plot is successful, not only will there be no Jews, but there will be no Jewish people, and there will be, if there's no more Jewish people, there will be no Jewish Messiah who is to be born. And if there's no Jewish Messiah, you and I will die in our sins and go to hell forever. So Esther is the story of the salvation of the Jews, but it's also the story of your salvation and my salvation and the salvation of the entire world. This book reminds us, like I said, God's not mentioned by name in the book, but he's there. And it reminds us that God works in the lives of both the great and the small, both the mighty king and the little Esther, and yes, even little Mordecai. Finally, I want you to see that there's a contrast and a picture, perhaps, of Jesus here. In the story, we saw that Esther was the virgin bride who married the king. And our story echoes that because the church, you and I, if we believed in Jesus as our Messiah, the church is the spotless bride who marries the king. In the story, the king's former wife had been displeasing and had been set aside, and Romans chapters 9, 10, 11 talk about how the natural branches of the nation of Israel had been broken off due to unbelief. It doesn't mean that all Jewish people are broken off or that God's done with Israel, but the ones that were not showing themselves to be true Israel had been broken off. That's what I mean by the natural branches. Those who were believing in the Messiah, they're certainly not broken off. In the story, we have Haman plotting against Mordecai and against all the Jews. Satan has said himself, he is the enemy against whom we fight. He has set himself up against Christ and against all men, but especially against believers and against his church. In the story, Mordecai convinces Esther to intercede on behalf of her people, and Jesus himself intercedes on our behalf, on behalf of the church. In the story, Esther agrees to intercede after the people have fasted for 3 days, both day and night. And of course, Christ interceded on our behalf and then went to the grave and was there in the grave for 3 days. In the story, Haman plans to have Mordecai executed for not bowing down to him. You remember the story of Jesus, how he was tempted by Satan to worship him, to worship Satan, and Satan's ultimate attack culminated on the cross. It was an attack that was overturned, and instead of being a failure, it became a great success on the part of Jesus because he rose from the dead. In the story, Haman met his end on the gallows that he had intended for Mordecai. And Jesus intentionally went to the cross that was prepared for us. He died in our place. In both cases, that which looked like certain death and defeat was turned into ultimate victory. The cross is not a story of defeat. The cross is a story that saves us, and it is our ultimate victory.